Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me for our regular updates on what's happening here in Washington, specifically on Capitol Hill. Obviously, the news of the day is going to be the President's State of the Union address tonight. What I'm hoping to hear from the President is not only a reflection of some of the things that we've done, whether it be our record investments in infrastructure, our investments around semiconductors, chips, the Inflation Reduction Act, and some of the implications of that. But also, more importantly, how we're both going to continue to tackle inflation. And while the numbers are coming down, particularly things like the price of gasoline, inflation is still hurting an awful lot of Virginia families. And I want to hear some of his ideas on how we're going to continue the challenges around inflation. Obviously, I also want to continue to hear issues from national security, our competition with China, and a host of other things. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those in the question and answer. One of the things my guest I'm bringing to the State of the Union is actually a lady by the name of Marguerite Bailey Young, 94-year-old woman from Fredericksburg, somebody who grew up on the Eastern Shore, has lived in the Fredericksburg area for a number of years, a former school administrator. And Miss Bailey Young is one of the beneficiaries from the Inflation Reduction Act. On the IRA, we often talk about what is done around green energy, but one of the things that didn't get as much attention was part of the law that really started the path towards negotiation on drug prices, but also put in place for all seniors a cap on the cost of insulin at $35 a month. Ms. Bailey Young takes two different types of insulin. This cap that is now in place is already saving her money. And at 94 years young, I'm proud to have her as my guest. And she is one of the literally thousands of Virginians who are already direct beneficiaries of the new law about capping insulin prices and starting us on negotiations around other drug prices to bring them down for the benefit of Virginians. The other piece of the Inflation Reduction Act, I was already on a call this morning on a project that had been previously announced in the wind energy space that may end up dramatically increasing their investment in Virginia, maybe up to a fourfold additional investment and literally up to 1,000 more jobs. I can't go into the details, but this is only taking place because of some of the tax incentives that were put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act around green energy, around wind energy. And again, I'm a big believer that the offshore wind investments that Virginia has made, we are all in, and that kind of investment could also generate a series of manufacturing jobs as we make Virginia, Hampton Roads in particular, the wind capital of the East Coast and hopefully of the whole country. I also want to make sure that I lay out a couple of other items. A number of us across the Senate have introduced legislation to try to extend the timeline for the Equal Rights Amendment. We all remember Virginia was the state that was 38th to sign on to the ERA. There was a question that some of the states that had changed their position on that, and the time had gone past when this constitutional amendment would have actually then been put in place, but I think we ought to go ahead and extend that time so that all Virginians, all Americans, women get the kind of equal rights that I think they deserve and would be enshrined in the Constitution through the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm sure we'll get to some of the questions on the Chinese balloon and some of the other matters that I'll be able to give you some answers on. But why don't I go ahead and talk about the balloon for a moment. I, like many, were concerned that this Chinese balloon was literally floating across the country. I pointed out that I could not imagine an American balloon being allowed to float across the mainland of China unimpeded. I have not received yet the full intelligence brief. It appears that the president did want to shoot the balloon down earlier on, and there was pushback from the Department of Defense. I want to really get to the bottom of that, because it seems to me at first blush, whether it was over Alaska or over parts of Montana, there could have been some ability to take that balloon down without potential loss of life or damage on the ground. But I want to hear out from the DoD. I don't think it's breaking any news to say that nation states spy on each other or try to do espionage on each other on a regular basis. I want to make sure I have all the facts, though, before we weigh in. I do think some folks are being a little shrill on their criticism of the president. Let's get our facts straight and understand, one, how this went, at least initially, from our DoD side, it appears undetected. Two, how we're making sure that we're monitoring not only this potential espionage effort, but others that may have taken place in the past. And then three, why we don't have a better protocol in place to address this kind of issue, or in the case of a potential adversary like China, is there some ability to have immediate communication so that if this was by any chance a mistake, things could be rectified. It does beg the bigger question, which is, United States-China relations. As you know, I've been a harsh critic of the Communist Party in China, its authoritarian treatment of its own citizens, whether it be the Uyghurs or the people of Hong Kong. I continue to raise the concerns about Chinese tech companies, whether they be TikTok or Huawei, the Chinese telecom provider, in terms of some of the national security issues they pose. I hope to be laying out, literally in the coming days, a more holistic approach on how we take on the question of foreign technology platforms and their potential threat to American national security. We kind of do this on an ad hoc basis at this point. We did it with the Russian software company a number of years back called Kaspersky. We've done it a few years ago with the Chinese telecom provider Huawei. There's a lot of discussion now around TikTok. I think we need a more holistic approach, and I've been spending an awful lot of time on that, and we'll hopefully have a legislative proposal for you and my colleagues literally, I hope, within the week. Why don't we stop at that point? And Laura, let me turn it over to you. I know we've got a lot of folks on the line, and I want to make sure I get to all their questions.
Will be Tom Fitzgerald with WTTG.
Senator, happy State of the Union Day. I want to ask you about the economy. Obviously, as you mentioned, it's a big issue. I want to ask you how the president has to talk about this tonight. The White House obviously wants to accentuate the positive news on the economy recently. I know you've been talking to Virginians a lot. You got real-world perspective on this that maybe people in the White House don't. How do you talk about the good data and still acknowledge the real pain that people are facing in the stores?
Well, Tom, I think we need to point out that in a positive way, I think I was surprised at the fact that the economy added over 500,000 new jobs last month. I think it's great news that we've got unemployment levels literally at almost historic lows. But I think we need to acknowledge as well that inflation that we saw in rising gas prices and rising rents, in supply chain problems, is still hurting an awful lot of Virginia families in a real way. I do think we've seen gas prices come down. I think it's roughly about $3.46, I think was the data I had from last week. We're starting to see some of the rises in rent increases actually slow a little bit. Obviously, we've seen a switch in the real estate market as both interest rates went up. That meant the real estate market itself is cooling. I do think some of those numbers and then people feeling it in their pocketbook, there will be a bit of a lag. And I think we need to acknowledge that. But I think the president needs to not just, cite the good data, but also acknowledge there's still a hangover effect from supply chain problems that came from COVID, from the fact that, frankly, the Fed, the administration, I think most of us got it wrong in terms of how serious inflation was and when it was rising at such a rapid rate a year ago. I think acknowledging that there was kind of conventional wisdom got it wrong, but now we're taking action to try to rein in inflation. So I think that balance between saying, hey, here's the data, but also the data doesn't mean much if your family budget is still feeling, this kind of pain. And I think we need to say some of the relief that's coming. I point to the $35 a month for seniors on insulin costs. I think there ought to be a cap on $35 a month for anybody that has the needs for insulin. I mean, I can tell you, I think I've shared with you, I got a type 1 a type 1 juvenile diabetes daughter. We've seen the price of insulin in my family go up 4 to 5 times over the last 20 years. I can afford it, but a lot of families can't. But putting that cap in place for seniors is a step in the right direction, starting the negotiation on drug costs so that we would join the rest of the industrial world on having lower price of drugs, saying to the American public, help is on its way, I think would be also something that the president should lay out, and lay out with specificity.
Senator, our next question is Angela Bohon with WTKR.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for having us. As you mentioned the State of the Union tonight, I'm wondering if there's anything specific that you'd like to see the president address in general or in terms of the China threat. I know you said you're still trying to get some answers, but do you feel like the U.S. should have done anything differently in terms of the Chinese balloon? Obviously, we're in Hampton Roads. Langley Air Force Base is responsible for this takedown. Anything you can say further on that?
Yeah. Again, I want to get a full brief from the intelligence community. When did we discover the balloon? When did we think it was going to be coming into American airspace? Why was there not in place a protocol on how we deal with this kind of circumstance? Both in terms of, particularly if the president said he wanted to shoot it down earlier and DOD said hold off. I got to still understand, particularly if it was spotted over Alaska at some point, why that we weren't able to take action. I think it begs a bigger question too, that relations with China have gotten very, very strained. And in the normal course, there should have been some ability for Chinese and American officials to communicate with each other in a back channel way, if necessary, to say, hey, was this a mistake? Or if it's not, we're going to take this out. But we want to do it in a way that doesn't even further increase tensions. So even when we have a tense relationship with a near-peer adversary like China, you've got to maintain communication. So I want to get that brief. I want to hear also about the communications channels. I also think, and I hope the president will address this, is we have a competition with China on who is going to win the battle for technology in the 21st century. I think that goes to the heart of our national security. When we saw a few years back that in the wireless communications area, someplace I've got some expertise from my business experience, that we were seeing a Chinese company, Huawei, dominate in the next generation of wireless technology, 5G. That was a wake-up call for me. It's one of the reasons why I then led the way to make sure that America would bring back the manufacture and the jobs around the semiconductor industry, and the CHIPS bill was a result of that kind of action. I think we're going to see similar competition with China around artificial intelligence, AI, around advanced energy. We've talked about wind and solar. I'm very interested in some of our investments in small modular nuclear, where China's making huge investments. I think the whole question around synthetic biology, and that means supply chain around our drugs, sources, supply chain around how we grow our food in a 21st century way. These are all national security issues in my mind. And in the 20th century, we kind of knew that national security was ships and planes and tanks. In the 21st century, a lot of national security is going to be around technology. And we are seeing a competitor in China unlike anything we've seen in the past. They are investing at levels that, frankly, our country should be investing in as well. And I hope we hear from the president a bit more of how we're going to build this coalition of friends and allies around the world to take on competition with China in the technology space.
Senator, our next question will be Joe Thomas with WCHV. Joe? Okay, we're going to move on to Mike Gooding with 13 News Now.
Senator, hi there. I wanted to just get a quick comment from you if I could. Since last time you and I talked, the Navy has suffered another apparent suicide aboard USS George Washington, which brings it up to 4 since last April, just involving the George Washington, and 8 overall, also involving the maintenance center at the naval base. So 8 since last April. Just wondering, is your sense that Navy leaders are engaged enough on this issue? Do you think they're doing the right things? Just what's your sense?
Well, Mike, these are obviously all tragedies, and any incidents of suicide in our armed services, and particularly we see this with our major Navy presence in Hampton Roads, is a huge tragedy. There may be specific and unique circumstances about this most recent incident, and time will play out on that. But I have huge concerns, both about the numbers on the George Washington, and as the command on the George Washington addressing this in a systemic way, making sure there's trust in the chain of command, so that if somebody is having mental health issues, they feel they can report and then get the assistance they need. On the others, Mike, and you've pointed this out, and boy, it was a wake-up call for me when I saw these sailors that were on limited duty status, oftentimes who've left their normal duty where they may have a support system, fellow crew members. They come to this limited duty status. Sometimes it's like a black hole where they can fall into an area where they could literally be a year plus. They may be trying to leave the Navy, and just the bureaucracy, the fact that they're working in this limited duty area where they don't have much of a support network. We need to do more there. Some of the stories I heard were pretty chilling. I know I'm staying engaged. I know my friend Tim Kaine is staying engaged. Any suicide is one too many in our armed forces and in the Navy in particular. We've got to keep the pressure on. So it's, there may be unique circumstances on this last incident, but we've got way too many happening on the George Washington. And I think we've got to have a whole different systemic approach to those sailors who are on this limited duty status, where they're already in a vulnerable position. And unfortunately, we've seen too many then take their life. And I think earlier intervention, more mental health services, the ability to feel comfortable reporting that you're going through some problems is absolutely critical. We owe it to not only the sailors who've lost their lives, but we owe it to all of the active duty sailors as well, some who may be experiencing some level of mental health duress.
Senator, our next question will be Jean Moreno with WFIR. Jean? Senator, we're going to move on to Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
I'm sorry. It's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Back to Jean.
Okay, I'm sorry. We were listening to Senator Kaine, your colleague here. Just a real quick question to Senator about going back to this Chinese balloon. And you're on the Intelligence Committee, obviously. Why can't we track these things off the coast of the Pacific, either from satellite or from radar or some other technology, and then take care of it over the Pacific? And is there some reason we couldn't detect this thing when it was still in the Pacific?
Well, Gene, again, I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee, so I want to be careful how I say this, and also I want to make sure I get that full brief. Suffice it to say, there may be certain ways that we have, and this has been in the public domain already, that the intelligence community may be able to see some of this earlier and then then, for example, you've already had the head of NORAD, which is on the DoD side, our air command for both Canada and America, that there may be some gaps in coverage. How we make sure that they communicate better, number one, is a question. Two, a question that I have is, if you saw this type of entity, you got to be careful about potentially taking it down over international waters, because other nations may be doing surveillance as well. But once it enters into American waters, or for that matter, if it's over an area that does not have a high amount of population, can we and should we take action? If we do take action, is how do we make sure that we are able to relay that to whomever the country that's launching the device, China in this case, in a way that doesn't escalate tensions? Because again, I don't believe the Chinese would have allowed an American balloon that was visible to fly across their mainland. These are the questions I want to get answered. I also would like to get answered when the president himself thought it was appropriate. Again, from what I read on press reports, the president said, let's shoot it down earlier, and the Defense Department pushed back on that. I need to understand that better. I also think it has been clear that we were gaining some intelligence in terms of monitoring the balloon, but what is that gaining of intelligence? Was it worth? Because how much was the Chinese able to get intelligence and then somehow relay that back? We do have tools like jamming tools that we use for a variety of foreign actors to try to make sure any kind of overhead that is trying to look at our capabilities, we try to jam them some so their effectiveness is limited. These are all questions, though, that I want to get answered. And again, I would hope, I know this is kind of a easy place to be critical of the administration. Let's get our facts first. My hope again is in terms of national security, I would still love us to get back to the notion that when it comes to national security, partisanship ends in our country's borders, that we can act in a bipartisan way. And in a lot of things, and most things, frankly, on China, we have acted in a bipartisan way. I think about our actions around the semiconductor bill. I think about our actions around Huawei. I think about some of the actions I'm taking in my committee in a bipartisan fashion about this competition in technology with China. So let me get all the facts, then I'll try to answer your questions as much as I can without obviously getting to anything that is in the classified arena.
Senator, our next question will be Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our
Hey,
questions. I got a happy one for you today.
Good.
2 puppies from the Envigo facility are competing in the Puppy Bowl this year, and they've already been adopted. But I know that was an issue that you were really active in. So how does it feel to see those actions come full circle in such a positive way now?
Well, I can tell you, if these beagles that were really in abusive circumstance get adopted, they're going to be the team that I'm going to be rooting for in the Puppy Bowl that takes place, as we all know, along with the Super Bowl. And the story, as you know, Amy, is it was really a heartbreaking story. We discovered this Envigo testing facility where upwards of 4,000 beagles, puppies, and adult dogs were just being kept in horrific circumstances. We went and said, you got to shut that down. There were colleagues in the General Assembly who worked with us, and they ought to get credit as well. We shut down the facility, and these puppies have been adopted all over the country, and for that matter, I think around the world. I think Prince Harry, adopted. He and Meghan adopted one of the puppies as well. I know. I was happy to hear that there were, since I did this with my friend Tim Kaine again, that there were puppies being adopted named Mark Warner and Tim Kaine. I'd love to, meet that Mark Warner puppy or that Tim Kaine puppy. But it really was a heartwarming story, and appreciate you raising it, that a couple of these puppies that have been adopted have made it through what I think is probably a very rigorous selection process to, I think, make it into the finals or the quarterfinals, at least, on the Puppy Bowl. And my hope is that these Virginia puppies, regardless of who we root for between Philadelphia and Kansas City in terms of the football team, then we can all get behind these puppies and rooting for them in the Puppy Bowl should they be in that final.
Senator, we're going to jump back to Joe Thomas with WCHV for the final question.
Somehow, I got to tell you, I think Amy's question about the puppies uplifting, I want to see if Joe can ask that same kind of uplifting question at the end here.
You know I will, because I got pulled out of a budget meeting with the reminder that we were doing this conference call. So thank you for pulling me out of a budget meeting. Mark, I know you've been an outspoken critic of the Chinese Communist Party intelligence services and their work inside inside TikTok's news feed. Twitter just released to the public that the State Department's global engagement algorithms are manipulating Twitter news feeds of American citizens. Isn't that just as concerning as the Chinese Communist Party intelligence services manipulating news feeds?
Well, first of all, Joe, what you're just telling me now about State Department manipulating Twitter news feeds, I need to understand that. I'm not sure how the State Department could impose its will on the Elon Musk-owned Twitter. But let me get the details, and then I'll try to respond. Let me also be kind of an equal opportunity. Senator Rubio and I sent a letter today to Mark Zuckerberg of Instagram, and they now call themselves Meta, that said that there were a number of Facebook employees that were both coming out of China and out of Russia and getting potentially access to data. That concerns me greatly as well. My concern on TikTok, as I've explained, is twofold. One, the amount of data that's being collected on Americans, disproportionately young Americans. But two, and let me be clear, Facebook and Google and Amazon collected a lot of data as well. It scares me more about TikTok, because at the end of the day, if the Communist Party in China says you got to turn that data over, they have no choice, but they have to turn that data over. It's what the laws in China require. But what almost concerns me more with TikTok is, 138 million Americans are what's called regular users of TikTok. They use it for about 90 minutes a day. I'm sure most of you who are on TV broadcasts, at least, or radio broadcasts as well, like you, Joe, would probably hope that your audience would listen to your stations 90 minutes a day. And my fear is that those algorithms that are still being written in Beijing, that the Communist Party, I'm not saying they're doing it right now today, but could mandate, okay, you want to only show videos that reinforce good images of the Communist Party, that denigrate Taiwan and its independence. It really can become a propaganda tool that should scare the dickens out of all of us, because at the end of the day, it's being driven by the Communist Party of China. And if they make that choice, I'm not saying it is right now. This is not dissimilar to the case we made with Huawei, where what finally got people and our allies around the world to start taking Huawei equipment out was not the fact that those calls that are happening real time on Huawei networks were all being listened into or their data being scraped. But at any moment in time, the Communist Party could say, because again, they have control over Huawei at the end of the day, they could say, we want to scrape that information and data. And again, in the case of Huawei, that's made it so that even countries that purchased Huawei equipment are now trying to back off. But it begs the bigger question, Joe, and that is, rather than trying to do this one-off with a whack-a-mole kind of approach, we ought to have a thoughtful theory of the case, place where these issues can be adjudicated, recognizing that whatever law we pass in this field, we've got to go into it eyes wide open, that we could very easily see other nation states pass similar laws and that those be used against American tech companies. So long answer, but again, as always, Joe, good question.
Thank you, sir. I
Senator,
look
that was
forward
our
to
final question.
fighting with-
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Be safe, and again, hope we all turn into the State of Union tonight. I'm looking forward to being there, and again, looking forward to my 94-year-old guest who is already seeing the benefits of that $35 a month insulin cap. Thanks so much.